sound you've had in ever.
Oh,
And
thank you. I'll launch my speaking career. Okay, I'm gonna hit this again. I don't know why I don't have to. Okay, I'll turn up volume too. All right.
Right.
La 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 la.
so I just texted Bruce, and it's 5:30, so I'll call the meeting to order. And we have one agenda item, a special meeting to discuss this language regarding the furlough. We've got a couple documents, so Nick, turn it over to you first, and then I imagine there'll be other cabinet members that will be talking about the impact of this, primarily Andrea.
So Andrea will go through kind of the technical end of the furlough language and kind of where we're at. And the reason that we're here tonight, having a little bit more discussion on this than just kind of putting it on the front end of ahead of the consent agenda Monday night, is the decisions you guys make or the discussions you have may have longer reaching impact. Because right now the furlough language is going to impact, I think Tracy, is it 26 potentially employees? Yeah. And so I think it would be 24 of the 26 school age care, and then 2 of the fitness center employees. Is that right?
20 school age care and 6 of the fitness center.
Okay. And so, as we look at this, you say, okay, well, this is a small group of employees. We could make decisions, a little bit different. But the concern that we have is the decisions that you guys are going to start making on this, if we aren't able to open in the fall face to face, these decisions could potentially impact hundreds of our employees, and how we handle the situation. And so that's why I thought it kind of warranted a little bit bigger discussion. A couple of brief points before Andrea gets into it is, originally when we were talking about furloughs versus termination, the big issue was the furlough keeps the cord connected to the employer. So it's not a full layoff. When you lay somebody off, temporary layoff, you have to pay out their leaves, vacation, accrued vacation. Basically they stop being an employee, for you. And then if you have recall rights and things like that, when you furlough, basically everything kind of almost sits in forbearance. When you say, Andrea, it just kind of sits there knowing that they're going to get to come back. So they don't lose sick leave. We don't pay out their vacation, things like that. However, the big difference for us is because of the ACA, or the Americans Care Act, when you furlough, the way the look back periods work and all these different components, it basically would mean that because the relationship hasn't been severed, we would have to continue to pay the health insurance. And so, again, it's not huge amounts of money, but when you start talking large numbers of people, it really starts to add up in a hurry. And Tim will be kind of sharing some budget numbers with you, at least as it relates to these different folks. But that's really the big distinction between the furloughs and the temporary layoffs is, are we going to continue to, pay the employer portion of health insurance and some of those different components. So with those kind of overarching things said, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to kind of talk about the specific language and how that works.
And if Tim Miner could share his screen with you, I have the handbook as a PDF, so you can see the red line version. That would be what I would be recommending at this time. Give that a moment. Oop, not that one. There we go. So there'd be a few different areas in the handbook that would need modification. So for example, the role of management, because we don't currently have any furlough option, we would need to modify that. Really, then we can jump down to the other more substantive areas. In the handbook though. So if you, go there, and it's on page 41.
And really what he just showed you, the reason you guys don't have a copy of that is just because it's just showing adding the term furlough.
Right.
Whereas the 2 pages that we've kind of pulled out for you are the actual meat and potatoes behind the furlough language. It's the description of it.
And so our proposal, the whole idea with adding furlough and modifying the layoff language is increased flexibility. So we certainly want to be good and kind in terms of being an employer, but we also want to increase our flexibility because of the actions that have occurred the last few months. We've identified this as a need, and frankly, statewide, this has been an issue on all the calls I've been on is how do we adjust our language to deal with our new reality? So our approach that's recommended here would be, first of all, to tweak the language a little bit in the layoff language to be a little bit more department specific than just building specific. So like with school age care, that we can address a department of school age care instead of EP Rock and then North Hudson. So just kind of cleaning that up a little bit. The big change in 15.6 would be to go from 30 calendar day notice to 14 calendar day notice. To go along with that, then we would have furlough language, which like Nick was saying, is much more of a temporary type of situation where they would maintain their employee status. So it's essentially a leave of absence, an unpaid leave of absence for staff. It would be at the direction of administration. But after consultation with our attorneys, we did identify the big hiccup with respect to furloughs is that under the Affordable Care Act, we would be required for a period of 3 months to essentially continue healthcare coverage. That adds significant dollars to that proposal. So that's why we think it's important to have the option of 15.7, the employee furloughs, when we have that shorter time period. But the employee layoff language, they play well together is how I would say. I would say that we look at either option as we're moving forward with staff decisions. 14-day notice for layoffs is the proposal, 7-day notice for employee furloughs. Don't think we would want to go any less than the 7-day notice because again, one thing we want to do is maintain relationships, right? We, even with layoffs, I mean, Tracy and I, and with the help of financial services, have been meeting with all the support or all the school age care staff the last 2 days. We want to be kind as we're moving forward, and we want to maintain those relationships even when we go into an unpaid status situation. So we feel that this is the blend of the two provides the district with increased flexibility, but we also, it's how you implement them, right? Like if you implement them, certainly being aware of the budget, but also being aware of the relationships we're trying to maintain. I think that is more determinative in terms of whether it's successful or not. Any questions on the layoff proposal and the employee furlough language?
Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Andrea, so just out of curiosity, what school districts or where did the models come from that were most helpful as you shaped this, or was it mostly working with our legal counsel?
Well, this mostly came from our existing layoff language. So you can see that layoff section 15.6 is there's only a couple parts that are modified. And so that being said, what I did was copy as much like the criteria used in determining who will be eligible or who will be subject to the layoff or furlough are identical in both scenarios. And so I did do cutting and pasting from our existing language. In terms of the other components, I looked at a variety of districts and then sent it on to Shana for her review and feedback. So I looked at Wausau School District, I looked at Green Bay, I looked at, I just did a search honestly, and like pulled up several examples and picked up different pieces from different districts of what I liked. And I started learning more about it because with the employee furloughs, I was seeing that even nationwide that there's quite a few districts, majority of the districts were offering benefits. And so that kind of struck me as why would they do that in an employee furlough? And now I know why. It's because they have to if they're offering it for that 3-month period under the Affordable Care Act. So that's kind of where I went. I drafted up the language at that point after reviewing all the samples, sent it on to Shana, and then we've been going back and forth on modifying it.
Mr. President.
Yes, Rob.
So Andrea, with regards to the Series 500 policies, I went looking through that, didn't see anything as it relates to layoffs or furlough. Why do we not have a formal policy Why is it only in the handbook?
Because it's really not necessary to have a policy. By having it as a handbook, which the board approves and considers every year. That's one good thing, is that we bring it to you every August, or like in this situation, we bring it to you as changes are needed. It's a more flexible, living, breathing document that allows us to adapt to certainly these unique times versus a policy. More that, to me, the overarching governing document that drives our analysis of the handbook. But this is a good example of why it's better to have it in a handbook as compared to policy, because we can modify it a little more easier.
Okay. So another question with regards to the number of days notice. You know, I know 3M, for instance, you know, they, in a layoff, they offer 45 days notice.
Mhm.
I know other major corporations, they offer at least 30 days.
Mhm.
You know, we're affecting these people's income and so on. Why wouldn't we offer at least 30 days for both furlough as well as layoff?
We absolutely could.
Mhm.
This gives us, in most of those cases with 3M and some of those private companies, they don't have a handbook that necessarily would govern that. I mean, they make those decisions. So this is saying, you know, if we were in a tough situation, we would have 7 days, you know, as a minimum notice. However, you know, as you look at the furlough language, it does basically, if you're furloughed, guarantees family insurance or our insurance contribution for up to 60 days.
But they're without income. And the challenge that I have is that when we look across the country and we see some of the issues with unemployment, sometimes not even being able to connect or make other plans, even though they have the opportunity under furlough, according to the document that we have, to do other work. For 7 days to be able to find that other job or apply for unemployment might not be an option for them. And many of our families work check to check.
Yep.
And so if we're able to provide more than, again, getting back to the 30 days, just for the sake of our families, because we do want them back, we do want to maintain a strong relationship, to be able to allow them to prepare properly, I think might be appropriate, in my opinion.
And to speak to that quickly,
But just so I understand, just because you're putting 7 days in the handbook doesn't mean that that's what you're going to do. You could offer 30 days, you could offer more. We're just saying, in a pinch, Rob, if we need to, like, and we gotta take action, or else we're going to significantly impact the budget. We could enact on 7 days, but because we've got the handbook at 7 days, that gives us that flexibility, but we could also go 30 days or more at any given time, should we choose to.
And a good example is how we're laying it out this time with school age care, right? Like Tracy met with them 2 weeks ago to give them the heads up that this is the direction we're going for the summer. We met with every single employee over the last 2 days to walk them through. This is what it's going to look like. We had benefits here. We had financial services here. We had resources. We called it the wheel of resources available at their disposal, right? So that it's the floor. It's not what we would seek to do.
Sure. And I understand what you're saying, Andrea, and I understand what Bruce is saying. You know, however, with a school district of our size, you know, 5,700 kids, 700 roughly employees, $70 million budget, if we need to make a decision like this within 7 days, I mean, there are other things that are likely at issue than just, you know, the budget or whatever the issue may be. I mean, to be able to offer 30 days, I think is fair for our families that may be affected, even though it's a small group. And even though, you know, we wouldn't necessarily do it within 7 days, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't offer 30 days. I don't see any reason why we would need to move that quickly, in my humble opinion, just to protect those families.
Okay.
So
That's only my opinion.
Mr. President, question. Can you be
Yes.
help understand, because the board's role is referenced in both of these, both in the language about layoffs and in the language about furloughs and furloughs. And I read the furlough language, the new language to read that action would be taken by the superintendent or his or her designate after consultation with the board. The first section about layoffs makes it sound more like the board is doing it. So can you, because I think part of that plays into Rob's question about the extent to which, Rob, there would be some conversation before this would happen. Because what I'm hearing is, why not give us the flexibility to, in dire situations, make a dramatic decision if we have to, knowing that there would be a conversation before either of those actions that the board would be part of, that hopefully would surface some of these concerns. But can you speak to that a little bit, Andrea?
Definitely. And I think this, it's a really good point, because the significance of a layoff as compared to a furlough is that it's that ending of the employment relationship. Tracy and I have been using, we don't like the word ending because we want to recall the staff, in the fall, but we've been using a pause. So it's a pause, but it's formal. Like, that's why board action is required. Just like what we did the other night and as part of the personnel pack with the layoff of a couple administrative assistants, is that it's the ending of that employment relationship at that time. A furlough is a leave of absence that's temporary in nature, that occurs quite often, that the board may or may not typically be involved in, but we make you aware of the more significant ones. Furlough would certainly be a significant one, and that's why we wanted to put that in there, so that's a requirement that we make sure we talk to you and work it through with the board before having that kind of a conversation, versus like a leave of absence to deal with an emergency for 2 weeks isn't something that would ever get to the board. If that makes sense.
If you'd prefer to have the language that the board will make decisions on this, we can absolutely kick it up to you.
Yeah.
I don't know that, Mr. President.
Yes, Bruce.
I don't know that this needs to be made at board level. I mean, I think you guys are making hiring and decisions about the budget. Once we've kind of assessed the budget, then you guys are making those decisions. I'm sure if you're going to do any layoffs or, again, this is a completely unprecedented time, and now we need to account for it. So what you're trying to do is put language in the document that provides flexibility. And I don't think all large corporations give 30 or 60 days. I know for a fact many will come in and they might make a decision to close the facility down, and many are in this trying time. They're making a decision and they're moving because this is completely unprecedented. So I think giving us flexibility at a district level is good. Being kind to our employees is also good. So because we're talking about writing documents here, I think Nick stated earlier, many of these organizations, they don't have policies. I mean, they have HR guidelines that they need to follow, but they're not stating or dictating, what and how something needs to happen on every single particular instance. And in most cases, you can't even start to acknowledge that, this is forthcoming, because it could have dire implications on customers or employees for that matter. So to me, I see it as more so an opportunity to offer flexibility as opposed to trying to set a policy around how much time we should be offering people. It's providing flexibility to the district.
Just clarification on that language. We got two different time periods that is written into 15.6 and two different bodies making decisions. So for layoffs, it's 14 days made by the board, because we already make decisions about hiring and firing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other time period is just creating this furlough, which I'm highly supportive of a furlough option that doesn't end the relationship and provides flexibility. It's just a question I think that Rob has raised is what's the appropriate minimum time period? Again,
Right.
emphasizing minimum because nobody wants to be just stuck with the minimum. I think that we've been a pretty good employer, and I think that for the most part, we would make these decisions and try to give as much notice as possible. And I can't envision every single possible scenario. I certainly didn't think strong about this pandemic thing before it happened. And we're into our third month after this and still getting used to what life is going to be like. We don't know how long this is going to last. I think I'm fine with keeping the procedures separate. That is one decided by the board, which is layoffs with 14-day notice, especially if we expect employees to give us 14 days notice when they quit. But when it comes to the furloughs, I tend to agree with Bruce. That's more of a budgetary issue, and we need to be as nimble as possible, understanding that we want to give more notice. If we can give 30-day notice that furloughs are coming up, great. But if there's a situation where it needs to be different, but I'm open to hear from anybody on the board too, is whether they think it needs to be the same amount of time for both. Maybe it does, but I see them as two different procedures, a layoff versus a furlough. I think I saw Bob have his hand up. So Bob, did you have a question?
I understand it's two different procedures. I tend to agree with Rob a little bit on I think going lower than 2 weeks to me is surprising because, like you said, Jimmy, we expect our employees or our consistency to operate. We expect 2 weeks. I can't think of obviously with the crazy times we're in now. I think that sounds. I mean, we've gone to great lengths to help out with some of our vendors keep their employees, like with the busing. I think 7 days is a little extreme. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Would there be an idea to have it could be 21 days for layoffs and 14 days for furloughs? I mean, I think we would love flexibility just to be adaptable, but I also hear what you're saying about not wanting to put employees in a terrible, situation either in terms of not getting paid. It was just part of the work process where we got to 14 and 7, but if there's a desire to modify that too, I mean, that's.
Well, Andrea, and I also want to correct something because Rob made reference that, we have X number of employees, we have 5,400 students. This policy is not applying to all employees of the district.
No, this is only support staff.
Right.
So
So how many support staff do we have that this is applying to?
26.
Under, 500.
500?
between 400 and 500,
Yeah.
probably somewhere in there.
All right. And so it's not, what does that mean that it applies to only support staff? So it's not applying obviously to our teachers and our certified staff, and it's not applying to administrative, right?
It doesn't apply to anybody you have a contract with.
Right.
Okay.
Mr. President,
Yes, Rob.
so, point of clarification, my comments around our $70 million budget and the number of employees and students we have is just simply to, I guess, re-stress the fact that we have such mass. If we need to take emergency action with 26 or so employees, frankly, there's something more serious going on than just, what we have at hand. And Andrea, to your point about, 21 days, I would be supportive of 21 days for both categories. Certainly it's not 30 as I would hope, but certainly that would provide more notice and help those families that might be put out.
And really, the pieces, and this is why it's a bigger discussion, is it's not just these 26 employees. These just happen to be the 26 or 30 that are first impacted by it. And I guess, the question becomes, okay, we get into next year and the new rules are, okay, you can open, but as soon as you have a case, you have to close for 14 days. And then you close 14 days and then you get to open again. And then you get to close for 14 days. And then you get to, and you have the back and forth. understand that if we, if we have 21 days or 14 days or 30 days notice, then essentially what it is we're going to pay those people regardless if we're open or closed. I mean, so that's the problem. We don't know. I mean, and that's where, because more than likely if they close us related to public health, it's them calling us on Friday or calling us on Tuesday and saying you can't open on Wednesday. It's not saying, hey, 2 weeks from now we're going to need you to close. And so that was the thought behind the 7 days, because if we close 5 times over the course of the year, essentially we would, at 14 or 21 days, we could essentially be saying we're going to pay people regardless of closure, because we wouldn't have enough time closed before we'd actually start not paying people. And we want to pay people. I can just tell you the biggest concern that we have right now is we don't know what the budget's going to look like coming up. And kind of the second piece with this happens to do with the fact that these happen to be Fund 80 employees, so they're enterprise fund in employees. And so, and Tim can kind of talk about, but that Fund 80 is supposed to be self-sufficient. But when you continue to pay people the regular salary, but we don't have any revenues coming in, it goes negative. And that's what's going to happen at the end of this year, to the tune of about $170,000. So that means then we are going to have to transfer money from general fund that was supposed to be designed to pay for education. And it's going to have to be transferred to Fund 80 to cover loss. The same thing with the food and nutrition funds and things like that. And so, not the end of the world, but what happens if all of a sudden we start talking about 2 months, 3 months, 4 months next year? We could get ourselves into a situation where you could have quite large fund, transfers over. And that's kind of the concern. I mean, we've wanted to pay. The reason we have said that, this would be the first group that we would lay off, even though we've been paying everybody full time, including this group, all the way through the end of June 9th, is because they're paid for out of funds that are supposed to be self-sufficient, whereas everybody else is paid for out of the general fund. I mean, we already got those dollars. I mean, we've already received those dollars. And I think that was kind of the push by the state and by the CARES Act or FFCRA was, you've already been given this money. You shouldn't be trying to make money off of not paying your employees. And I don't think we want to do that. But the big concern is, the challenges that we may potentially have next year. And it could all be moot. And now all of a sudden, now we have, a Supreme Court decision that might mean that we can open up school age care sooner than we think. However, we don't quite know. And so we want to be good employers. I think we have been really good employers. We've gone out of our way. We're basically paying people for 10 weeks, some of which will not work hardly at all over those 10 weeks, and kept their insurance benefits intact. But I think there's going to come a point where people are going to start to look at that and say, you're going to continue to pay people, you're not working.
Mr. President.
Yeah, Rob.
And so, Nick, I think you made a couple of really good points. If it happens to be 14 days on and then you get notice and then it's 14 off and 14 on and so on, that could create, several issues, for us, as you've said, not the end of the world, but certainly puts us in a less positive position. But the flip side of that is the families that are impacted, 14 on, 14 off. And if it's more than just, to your point, if it turns out to be, 50 families or 100 families or whatever, what we might do to those families who do live many times check to check, it is the end of the world for them without this proper notice. So again, I mean, I'm just one of 7, but certainly I would be supportive of the 21 days. Anticipating that we are a good employer, and I think having that flexibility for our employees that are affected would be a positive and in line with being a good employer.
Mr.
Mr.
President.
President,
All right. So I got Heather and then Sue.
Sue, but go ahead, Heather.
so I wonder if we might resolve this by looking at the language. So right now, as I look at it, the language in the first part of the document, the language that was in the old part about layoffs says the board will make every effort to provide at least 14 calendar days. So it doesn't set a floor. It says we'll try to provide this larger number. And then the language below says employees will be given as much advance notice as possible, but not less than 7. So it provides a hard floor. I mean, it kind of seems like both of them are saying the same thing. So I wonder if we shouldn't, unless there's a reason not to, Andrea, but use a similar approach with the language in both. I mean, so we could for both of them say, not less than 7, not less than 14, knowing that we hope to give more. Or we could put a larger number in there that makes us feel better, like 14 or 21, but with that language that says we will make every effort to provide, which still gives flexibility in extreme situations to provide less. So do you see what I'm saying, Andrea? So is that difference in phrasing intentional, or might it make sense to have them both use the same phrasing, giving us flexibility both ways?
The language in the layoff, I just didn't touch it. So it was been that way. I guess my preference is more the language of the furlough, where it says as much advance notice as possible, but not less than, like having that floor. Just because you always want to do better than that floor, right? But I get it's not. If we go with one or the other, it's fine in both places. Like I think I'm just more naturally inclined to do, as much notice as possible, but not less than this. But I get that it has a little bit different message in that.
Well, because the existing language, we could go less than 14 calendar days.
Right.
Well, it's actually 30. I mean, what you're
It's
seeing
30,
on your thing, it's for, this is the revised one. So the furlough language of 7 guarantees at least 7 days, whereas the language above and what's been in our employee handbook for a long time has been, we're going to make every effort to do at least 30 days. However, we reserve the right to lay you off tomorrow.
Right.
Where, you could change it, change them both to be the one in the furlough language, which does put a hard minimum on it, whether it be 7, 14, 21, whatever you may want to do. And again, if you want to do 21, I mean, we're fine with that too. We're just trying to look at, what's going to give us the most flexibility if we get in a tough spot. But if the board says, you know what, we would rather err on the side of paying people all the way through than potentially have them go on and off the payroll, then that's absolutely you guys' prerogative.
I mean, I guess I would lean toward thinking as an employee, I would like, to your point, Andrea, to know there's a hard floor, even if it's a very small hard floor,
Right.
but to know that we're going to try to do more, so to have a hard floor of maybe 14 for a layoff and 7 for a furlough, but have that language that, and I'm on that page right now, but that makes it clear, we'll do our best to provide a lot, enough, but it will definitely be no less than, that to me actually feels better than going to the board will make every effort to provide 21 days, which could mean 0.
True. Yeah.
Sue, you also had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Andrea. So Andrea, once we figure this out tonight, will you be sending out some kind of formal heads up letter to these 500 people so they will know that they're, whatever we come up with tonight, the 14 or the 7, they're going to know what they'll probably think of it as a predicament, but we'll know the situation. And I'm going to go along with what someone else said, maybe Jamie, but we got to be mindful that we never know what's coming down tomorrow from Evers and state administration and so on. So you know, it's kind of quixotic. And so flexibility is something that's really valuable at this point in terms of how we're dealing with employees.
And in terms of communication, yes. So for example, like when you guys modified the support staff language for vacation, like allowing people to use vacation through the 31st of December, there was an email sent out to every support staff member affected, and we had it checked off. My administrative assistant made sure that everybody received that message. And so we would do something similar here where we've already had the in-person meetings with all of the people affected by what we're looking at doing right away. We also, we are going to be sending out letters of intent in a couple weeks to all support staff employees as well. I think this is a really important piece of information that they know. We'll have to couch it, and I'll work with Tracy on the verbiage to use to not make people nervous. But at the same time, my core believes in transparency and answering the why, right? So I want to be transparent with where we are with the language and explain why we're there, right? Like it's this unique circumstance in this world that has called for language that we wouldn't have contemplated a year ago. And so I think if we explain that well, it'll be better received than not. Yeah.
Okay, Bob, you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, are we furloughing this group or laying them off?
Well, I mean, that's going to be kind of part two of the discussion. So, you know, a couple of things just to want to clarify. You're not taking action on this tonight. I think taking action on a non-regularly scheduled meeting on something this big, I don't, so this is a discussion item only tonight. And what we're hoping to get from you guys is direction so that when we come back for the 26 meetings, we're able to have the language set up in a way that you guys find acceptable, so then you can take action on 26, even though it's not normally a regular, it's a work session, but at least it's a regular meeting. And so, you know, that's why we need some level of consensus on this piece first. Okay, you know, are you okay with furlough language, or how do you want to finalize furlough language? And then the next piece is we need some direction on thoughts on what you guys' thoughts are on this. So go ahead, Bruce.
So as a board, we have a responsibility to both our employees and to the taxpayers. And to offer flexibility in the language is not saying that it's an absolute. It gives us the flexibility to look at our current situation in any given time and make the right and best decision for our employees and for the public, which I think we've done exceptionally well as a board. I think, in my humble opinion, to put more onus onto the language that locks us down to something, to unknowns that may come up in this unprecedented time, is not in the best interest of the taxpayer. It's only in the best interest of the employee. And I think we've proven in our time that we've done the right thing by the employees. So again, I would suggest that we look to make sure that we're putting language in that gives us flexibility to make decisions in that given moment based upon the revenues that we have coming in from the state, the federal government, and not putting more back onto our potential taxpayers if we're put into a predicament where we're on again, off again next year, which we have no idea what that will look like. So I would just prefer that we keep the language to a point where it's not too onerous on having to put potential liability back into the taxpayers' hands for the language.
So Bruce, this is Heather, would you lean toward then the language that says that we will do our best to provide X without setting a floor, to give complete flexibility there? Is that what you're leaning
Yeah,
toward?
I am. I think to keep it to, you know, we'll make our best effort, and giving the information up front so everybody understands where we're coming from, I think, again, gives the flexibility, because it's not going to drop them on their, off on their feet. And I don't know that I could think of an instance in which we would have 7 days, but if we were forced into this on again, off again, and we had to make these quick decisions back and forth, it could possibly be something where we would have to enact on something like that. But I think people would know that that was coming. I don't think that, we would just go into the school year without some guidance from the Health and Human Services that this might be possibly how we would act this coming year. And in which case we would have to communicate in advance what might be a possibility. So I don't know. I just feel like this last year we've done very well by our employees. I mean, think of the millions of people that haven't had that luxury. They've had to go collect unemployment, and in some cases, for certain individuals, they're making more money than they would have had they stayed employed and working. So there's just so many different scenarios that are taking place out there right now. That for us to take the action to have flexibility at the district level with the language is the best position we could be in, because now we're not locked into something, and at a later time we can always add more time, and that's what we've done as a district. So to lock ourselves in advance, I think, is not the fiscally right thing to do by our constituents in the district.
Mr. President,
Yes, Carrie.
I would concur with Bruce, and I think this segment of employees will head into the school year with full knowledge that they could be in limbo at any point and might seek alternate employment, but that's a risk we'll take. Certainly we don't want to lose anyone, but we also don't want to put them in the position of being in that precarious financial situation. So I think this is both fiscally and prudently the best option that we need to pursue.
All right. Anyone else have comments on that? I'm just looking at the language here on my, it's saying that, you're right, the board will make every effort to provide at least 14 calendar days notice to affected employees. That's for layoffs. And then our language, which again has 0 for a guaranteed minimum. And then employees will be given as much advance notice as possible, but not less than 7 calendar days prior to implementation of the furlough whenever possible. So
There is that little,
even that whenever possible even doesn't really give a hard minimum 7, does it?
no, you're right.
So,
Yeah.
all right. So we've got different numbers have been thrown around. We heard making them the same at 30. We've heard right now the recommendation is 14 for layoffs on as much as we can try to as a board, and 7 for the furloughs. Is there a number that we want to fall on that falls in between there and yet keep the discretion, as Bruce and Carrie put it, of, as we'll provide as much as X number of notice whenever possible? So, yes.
One
Sue.
comment, sorry, Mr. President.
Yes, go ahead, Andrea.
One comment, I would recommend a differentiation between the two vehicles, because otherwise it gets tough to decide, okay, a layoff versus a furlough. Like, I think the cessation of employment with the layoff, technical cessation of employment, I think is a more significant action than the furlough, because they get to maintain their benefits. So otherwise, you can imagine with applying the language going forward, we don't want to be in a situation where we're going to pick this group of employees to furlough with the same timeline because they don't have insurance, because they're part-time, right? Like, we don't want to be picking and choosing like that. I think to have some natural definition between the two types of vehicles, I think is important. And I do want to be really transparent with the conundrum that the board will face on the 26th, is that because we don't have any, these modifications aren't yet adopted, we will still be asking for the board to act on the language that you will just have hopefully approved at that same meeting and implementing it right away. So it's tough.
Which May 26th will
Yeah.
be 14 days prior to June 9th. So you're kind of advocating for trying to keep the 14 days. It's just a question of whether it's a hard and fast absolute minimum or whether it will be this, endeavor to keep it to be 14 days. But, in an absolute emergency, like Bruce was saying, we can't even contemplate at this time, leaving that option. Okay, Sue, did you have something more you wanted to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I respect Rob's perspectives from, more the industry. I found myself responding positively to what Carrie and Bruce said in their justifications for the language. And also I value very much the multiple research models that Andrea looked at. I have not done research on this. I only learned the word furlough recently related to some FIPS work that I do and the employees there. But so it's a huge new thing. So I guess I'm supportive of what we have here. And if Andrea and her team reflect a little bit and do any tweaking, that would be fine. But I think the number, I'm settled. I'm happy with the numbers.
Mr. President.
Heather, yes.
So again, Andrea, I would like to see us use the same language in both sections. And I will say, I think I kind of feel like we should call a spade and either set a minimum or not. Now that I reread that, you're right. The first time I read it,
That was my intent.
Not less than 7 calendar days. That makes it sound like there's a floor, and then there's that whenever possible. So I like
I would view it as a floor. Like, I think the lawyer in me put that whenever possible in the end, but I would view that as a floor.
Well, and I like the idea of, even for the terminations, the layoffs, saying that that will give as much notice as possible. Because I'm guessing there are times when we know about terminations more than 14 days and we would let them know. So I like the idea of whatever your final proposed language is. I like the idea of in both of them making it clear that we're going to give as much as we can, and it will be no less than whatever.
And an example of that would be our staffing too, right? Like when we were working with administrative assistants at the high school, we let them know back in January and February that their layoffs would be effective at the end of, or June 9th. So yes, we, as a practice, normal course is that we give months and months of notice. It's just, we're in very different time.
Okay, Rob, your question? Yeah.
Nick, we've been talking about this group of 26. Worst case, how many employees would qualify to be laid off or furloughed?
You're talking about like if we didn't come back in the fall?
Well, you said the 26 was a small number compared to what could be next year. What is that maximum number, do you think?
I would say
Roughly.
It's probably between 300 and 400.
Okay.
Because really what you're looking at is, as we look at this, it's okay, if we didn't come back in the fall, or if we were operating more of a virtual, but which employees could we keep employed? There may be certain office staff that are still working, answering phones, still doing a lot of that stuff and things like that, but there may be, there may come a point where, after the buildings have been cleaned and we're done, then you have 75 custodians that all of a sudden are you going to continue to pay them at full rate when you might only need them a couple hours a week? And so same thing with food service, that's as we are making meals for the curbside, however we're not running 8 kitchens across the district. And so it really, the tough thing is it's hard to know. because, right now we've been, I think the district's been pretty generous with how they've done things for all of our staff, and rightfully so. I mean, we wanted to be supportive of our employees, but one of the things we talked about today with our admin team, principals and cabinet was if we happen to close or not be able to open in the fall, for our hourly staff, that right now some of them are working, some of them aren't. Some of them are working a few hours, some of them aren't. I mean, we're probably going to have a better handle on who's actually working remotely, who can do their job remotely, and what makes the most sense. Because for this reason, like Andrew articulated, well, you're laying me off because you don't have to pay me benefits, but you're keeping this person on because you got to pay them benefits, even though they might not be doing something similar to their job responsibility. So that's where we're going to have to, we'll have a better handle on that. But I would say, like Andrew said, we probably have close to, 400 full-time support staff. We can't operate with 0 support staff ever. We can't do it right now. So, probably somewhere between, it could be anywhere between 300 or 400, or it could be a combination. And I think the thing is with furloughs and layoffs, some of those can be partials. Is that correct, Andrea? So it might be that, okay, they're furloughed 20 hours a week and they're still working 20 hours a week, or they're they're laid off 20 hours a week. And, and so there are the ability to do partials as well. And so we would have to look at that.
And that's a good point. I'm actually modifying the language as we speak, so I can say in whole or in part. Because,
the thing we don't really have a tremendous ability to do is just say to somebody who we have a letter of an assignment with, we told you you're going to work 8 hours a day or whatever it is for 192 days. Now I only want you to work 6 hours a day. I mean, we have to, there has to be some process to adjust it. So we don't just, this week now I'm working 6, next week I'm working 8. Now the week after I'm working 7. I mean, so that's where the partial layoff or partial furlough could come into play, which also then would allow them to potentially qualify for unemployment for the hours they have been reduced. So if they get dropped to 20 hours a week, they could file unemployment for the other 20 hours that they're not working.
Mr. President.
All right. Rob?
So I'm going to move on to a different question. In 15.7, employee furloughs, guideline number 1 talks about the accrued time off, vacations, sick leave, personal leave, so on, that they are not permitted to use. And so in the case of a layoff, we would pay them their benefits, vacation, whatever time owed. In the case of a furlough, if they have an earned benefit and they want to use vacation as an offset to the loss of income, is that something we could do, or why is it we would not allow them to use that time?
We could, and we could carve it up in different ways, because that is an option that some districts do utilize. So with important point about layoffs though, is that they only get paid out their vacation. They lose the other banks of time, technically. But we would say if we recall them, we would reinstate that within X number of months, right? But so the idea with subsection 1 there, I mean, we could allow them to use vacation or personal leave. Potentially, it's just added cost to the system. But the other piece that I wouldn't recommend doing would be sick leave use during that time. Just because then you get in a conundrum where if they come back and then get sick, they don't have any leave to use. So
Sure.
That would be one where I would definitely want to carve that out, and where I've seen other districts carve that out as something that they're unable to use. But some districts do allow for vacation and personal leave.
Is that something that, I know Tim has some financial documents to, I mean, obviously you're talking about balance sheet impact versus P&L, but it's still cash. And so, I mean, I guess that would be what I would want to understand is if we're moving into furlough, is it because we're in a situation where we are worried about cash, in which case letting them use vacation does not help if you're paying out the same money.
Right.
I think that's what I need to better understand then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, in all of these things, I think if we feel like we're in a position where, we can weather the storm, we'll try to balance that with trying to, public purpose. of utilizing the money. I mean, right now we've utilized the public purpose version. You know, why we've continued to pay people is because one, we've been told by federal law that we're supposed to. And two, the concern was we didn't know when we were going to come back. And so we didn't all of a sudden want to lose a bunch of people, but there's going to come a point where you guys are going to say, yeah, you know, we don't want to lose a bunch of people, but however, we can't continue to underwrite we can't continue to underwrite that potential by continuing to pay people their full wage, even when they're not working. And so, you know, so that'll be the challenge. I mean, so the next sheet is, or I guess let's just kind of put some level of closure on this. I mean, just to kind of recap, do people want a hard floor in this or not a hard floor in this? I guess, and it could be as little as 7 days, but I mean, that's where Andrea could take the when possible out of the furlough language, the last whenever possible, and then that basically makes it a hard floor. And if you want, we can take that same language and apply it to the layoff language and make that a hard floor of 14, because the layoff is a more event. Are you guys okay with that, Bruce?
Bruce.
I'm just curious, you know, every state's a little different, and I've not looked at any of the HR policies at the state level. And it may be dependent upon the total number of employees as well, but is there a set HR like state mandate for layoffs that we need to make sure that we're not?
The WARN Act. So like, yeah, a plant closure or something like that, where there's federal guidelines that dictate the amount of time.
Yeah.
Not specific, because we have only done like the 26 and we have 900. So that's just such a low amount. But I can certainly talk to Shayna, because that's something else that's never become an issue with public entities before. Such, you know, because there's not a plant closure, or there's not like they can't close public works. But I think it's a really good question, and I'm guessing Shayna can get us the answer pretty quick, and I can look too. But I just know for this group of employees, and with a typical furlough or a typical layoff, it wouldn't trigger the WARN Act.
Yeah, and I think for me anyway, my concern is more that we're just not drafting any language that's going to be, you know, against any federal or state laws that we, you know, can't actually stand behind. So as long as we're there, I would just continue to state we don't want to put language in that doesn't provide flexibility. Again, we've shown time and time again, we're going to do the right thing. And as long as we're focused on making sure that we're always looking out for the best interests of our employees and the taxpayers, providing language that gives us that flexibility is really what I think we need to be going after here. And I think that was the intent of what you were initially trying to draft. So as long as we're not stating any, you know, going against any laws, I think we just need to try and keep that flexibility.
Okay. And just, I feel like we've talked through all this reasoning, and everyone's talked about the numbers and so forth and the language. I'm hearing Heather wants to see them be identical and treated the same, layoffs and terminations, and other people said it should be a separate process, and it should be a longer period for layoffs than, you know, than furloughs. So, and I'm hearing Bruce say he wants flexibility, and, you know, so do we, I am personally fine with having the language not be the same for the two procedures and treat them as different procedures, and also have some flexibility built in. But I think the best way to approach this is to have a motion. Either we agree with the administration's recommendation, or we make a motion that modifies the language. One or the other, it gets a second, then we can discuss it more, and then we move forward. That's what I would propose.
Heather's trying to clarify her position.
To clarify, and I think Andrea got this based on how she responded, I wasn't suggesting that the language and numbers be identical. I was suggesting that the language be identical around floor, flexibility, but that the numbers would be different. So I think, Andrea, you understood
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And I'm sorry if I said numbers the same. I didn't say that you advocated numbers. You advocated same language. And what
Yeah.
Bruce and Carrie were saying, they didn't necessarily think that the language need to be the same for the two procedures. That's what I heard. I heard that Andrea wants to have them be different processes because they are different. They don't have to be identical except for the numbers. I know you feel that way, Heather. I understand.
No, let's ask. Andrea's giving a quizzical look, Jamie. I don't think that Andrea was advocating for different language and different procedures necessarily.
Well, no, I think I think, Heather, once we talked it through, I think we are in agreement that you understand the difference for the board taking action with the layoff.
Yep.
And then the administration consulting with the board.
Correct.
My understanding is the language that you wanted to be identical would be the employees will be given as much notice, advance notice as possible, that sentence.
Correct, that one sentence.
And the timelines could still be different. One quick reason I just, the suggestion where we were looking at it, employee furloughs in whole or in part, we can't do that because that is one point. I just recall when I talked to Shana, because we have the specific language in sub 3, employees are prohibited from working for the district during a furlough, but may work for another employer. That's because that's a Department of Labor regulation, because most often when you see a furlough is with shutdowns, employee or government shutdowns, where there's a lack of funding for a period of time. There was a bad practice for a long time where employers would still require the employees to come in and work. And because of that history, we are not allowed to do partial furloughs. So we can do partial layoffs. So that would be the vehicle we would use if we were doing a reduction in hours. If we're doing a furlough, it's full or not, which so to avoid any kind of wage and hour issues where the expectation is that you work but not get paid. We can't go down that road. So that's a clarifying point.
I was merely speaking to the one sentence that contains the number, that one sentence would have similar language. Yeah.
And which language is that? That's the thing that we haven't discussed. Are we taking the one from the layoff paragraph and moving it down to furloughs, or are we moving the furlough paragraph and moving it sentence and moving it up to the layoffs?
Furlough up, I believe. But tweaked, right? Like, because we got to make the language make sense. So it will make the board or employees will be given as much notice, will just be translated up into that first paragraph. Instead of the board will make every effort to provide, is how I was hearing.
Okay, I got that. I can follow that. And then are we dropping the whenever possible language as well? So we're moving it up, but not all of it. Not the whole sentence from the furlough. We're dropping that whenever possible.
Yes, that's what I was hearing. Yep.
All right. So now we are going to have mirrored language in a hard floor, and you're saying 14 days for layoffs and 7 for furloughs. I got that right, Heather?
That works for me. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have, well, a motion to that regard then? So we can.
Well, I mean, we don't have action listed on this. I mean, it just, if we can get a general consensus, or even, we have a majority of the board that says yes, at least draft the language that way, and then you guys can, if you want to tweak it in a week and a half, you absolutely can. We just wanted to make sure we weren't going to bring something for you guys to vote on that is so far out in left field that you guys are kind of like, there's just no way.
No, and I do think, I mean, furloughs and layoffs are different, right? A layoff, a person, they will not have a job when they're laid off. I mean, they may have an opportunity to hire back, but at that point in time, the decision has been to sever ties. A furlough is, we don't want to that employee, but because of financial conditions, we need to take a break, essentially, because we may not have funding that's coming in to support that specific action. We know funding will be turned back on, and once it is, we'll want to bring you back as an employee. So I think those are the clear definitions, if you will. I mean, we're not looking to get rid of people there in that situation. So therefore, to your point earlier, Heather, we wouldn't want them using any, I think it was you who was asking about, using sick leave or paid time off. Maybe it was Sue who was asking that. But the point is, yeah, absolutely. We're trying to take cost actions at that point in time instead of allowing people to continue to use those funds that are essentially a part of our budget. I'm fine with the language that's proposed. I would have consensus for that.
Mr. President,
Others, yes, Rob.
and I've been making the case here to increase 7. And I understand the need for flexibility. If potentially this could impact upwards of 400 families, and more than once or twice potentially, to be able to provide those families not 7 but 14 days. I think as a good employer, as all of us collectively have continued to state that we have been a very good employer, to be able to provide those families that time to find other temporary employment or find other opportunities, I think is fair. Will an additional 7 days impact the budget? Certainly, but not as much as it'll impact upwards of 400 families. So, and with that, I'll remain silent.
Mr. President?
Others, yes. Carrie?
Go ahead, Bruce.
No, it's okay.
In regards to, since we can't offer temporary or I'm sorry, partial furloughs, Andrea, could you incorporate partial layoffs into the language for the 26th so that we can also address, if that affects the benefits or whatever, so that we can fully vet that?
Yeah, so the language as it exists in 15.6 does allow for partial layoffs. So it's and we do partial layoffs quite often in any position employed by the district in whole or in part. So we do have that flexibility.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the language? So other than Rob, I'm hearing that everyone's good with 14 and 7. And Rob, I don't want to misstate what you said, but you would want 14 for both.
Correct.
Okay. Anybody else? Now, was there going to be anything more to the meeting here, Nick, other than giving direction on this language?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the second part, we get a little bit of direction on this. The second part of this discussion is, so we have our first group of employees that may be impacted by this. Right now, we only have layoff language until you guys approve furlough language. And so I believe the sheet that Tim can now put up on the screen has to do with kind of where we're sitting with Fund 80 and some of these other things. You can kind of start to see how quickly this can snowball. Tim, if you can zoom in to basically the columns, 5 columns to the left, so people can kind of see what's going on there. And you start to see, if you go down a little bit, this top one is school age care. And what you can start to see is we go from kind of bouncing around between, finishing the month in the good, finishing in the bad, and a lot of that has to do with cash flow, to all of a sudden you look at, go down a little bit, Tim, thank you. You look at basically April, May, and June, based on the fact that we continue to pay the employees and we don't have very much revenue coming. You see how all of a sudden it starts to go down in a hurry. And the reason June is only 28,000, because right now we're just projecting paying them through the 10th of June. Have not, talked about paying them beyond that. I mean, we have talked about it. I mean, that's kind of the decision. And so, our thought is the commitment that we originally made was we were going to pay staff through the end of the school year, but our calendar year, but not necessarily we were going to all of a sudden, people that were going to be summer school teachers, we're all of a sudden going to pay them. And then people, all these different things where, seasonal employees and things like that. So we were under the impression that we were under kind of the thoughts that we would, starting this summer, starting to either lay off or furlough employees. if we don't have work for them. You know, where this starts to snowball, if you go down, Tim, is, and again, Tim Erickson, feel free to jump in at any point, is you keep going all the way down. You can start to see, okay, this is community ed, and then it's the fitness center. At the bottom, you can see what our projected fund balance is for Fund 80. It's about $170,000. That's just based on the decisions we've made right now. It's $170,000 in the hole. So that means we'll have to transfer money from 10 to 80. So then the question becomes, okay, and Tim can talk through the different costs if we decide to furlough versus lay off come June 10th. Go ahead, Tim.
So, yeah, so if you're looking at furloughing, then we'd be providing insurance for 3 months. And the cost for those employees is roughly $15,000 per month total. So for the 3 months, you'd be talking about $45,000 additional. But look at that very bottom number there at 168. We would expect to add 45,000 to that number. So we'd be about $213,000. And that, as Nick mentioned, that would need to be transferred over from the general fund.
And the reason why this is a big decision is because kind of the decisions that we make now could potentially have the impact on the larger number of employees come fall, whether we determine to furlough or to temporarily lay off. And Tim, I don't know, do you have an idea about, on average with support staff per month, about per person, what we're paying in insurance?
Average for support staff per month per person. Yeah, I probably need to go back and calculate that one, but you know, there are different. I probably jump in to talk a little bit about levy, which we've never had before here, but some districts levy. A number of districts do levy for community service, and so that could be an option that could be considered as well as we look at community service at the fund overall. What we'd be looking at there, you can look at a number of different combinations of things going forward. Again, it's a lot of uncharted water, so we don't know what this looks like going forward. But one thing is to reduce costs. Another is it could be a combination of different things like reducing costs, increasing fees, adding a levy on. For example, if you looked at adding levy revenue to Fund 80, the impact on the mill rate, if you wanted to look at it in terms of money raised and in impact on the mill rate, if you levied $46,000, that's essentially a penny additional on the mill rate. So those types of things can help the fund, help Fund 80. And as you see the breakout, it's in 3 different functional areas. We've got, as Nick covered, some of the school age care at the top. In the middle section, you've got community service fees, community service operation for the classes that are put on. And then at the very bottom are the operations for the fitness center. So it's really 3 different areas that we look at. We're looking at how these things are operating. So again, though, going back to the furlough, roughly in this scenario, it would be about $45,000 additional cost to this, that would add to that deficit.
It'd be 30, Tim, wouldn't it be 30,000? I mean, because we'd only furlough up to 60 days.
Yes, if you furlough, for the 60 days, it would be 30,000.
So, I mean, it's one of those things where we would prefer, I think, to furlough if we knew it was going to be a shorter period of time. So if we thought it was going to be, a month or a little bit more, then obviously there comes a point where even though you might save a little bit on not paying the insurance premium, you're going to spend a lot of time getting these people back on your, getting all the paperwork processed for them to go onto Cobra, then come back off of Cobra and things like that with a layoff. And so that's kind of where we talked about in the furlough language, that if we furlough, essentially we'd be guaranteeing the health benefits or our portion of the health benefits based on their FTE for 2 months. In neither of these situations, if they're furloughed or laid off, neither situation would they get their actual salary. This would be just, it's the difference between health benefits. And I think, kind of what I was getting at with Tim is if we, if on average we're, if you just look at these 26, 28 employees or whatever it may be, and you're talking $15,000, so you could figure it's $500 to $600 a month per support staff employee, because some people don't get benefits, some people do. If you're talking a couple hundred people, you could be looking at $1 million a month. So that's why they're pretty big decisions. And then, one of the concerns we had originally, we did look at a 90-day furlough, would be what happens if they say we can't open in the fall and we can't open until January. You have 3 months potentially we could be shut down on top of what we've already been shut down. So do you have thoughts either way? What your thoughts are? I just wanted to give a graphic illustration of how this can start to snowball in a hurry. Yes, we want to be good employers, but boy, this can start to take a lot of money. And this is just Fund 80, which is a really tiny part of our overall budget. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, the other side of this is the revenue that the state's getting, or lack thereof, because businesses are closed or not seeing revenue. So when this starts to go down and we're not getting financial funding from the state because they're in a deficit, or potentially, who knows, if this continues on that long, the amount of taxes that the state will be receiving will be significantly cut. Therefore, our funding most likely will be cut, and this thing snowballs really, really fast. So I guess one quick question, because I agree with you. I think it is short-term furlough is the better way to go, because we're not in a position where we have to go back and hire those individuals or find them. If we were to lay them off and then we find out 2, 3, 4 weeks down the road, we're ready to rock. Can we furlough and then lay off if, in fact, we find out after a month that this is going to be a long-term situation?
Andrea, I guess I defer to her.
We can do it temporary, but it would then require another action, right? Like then we'd have to know relatively quickly with the turnaround to see what that next step would be. But as long as we follow the guidelines, I mean, we can.
Yeah, but I think in a furlough situation, you may make that decision today because it's the best decision with all the information that you have available. But 3 weeks from now, things drastically change because numbers go up in this pandemic, and Governor Evers changes the guidelines, and it's going to be pushed out 6 months. We would be forced to make some different decisions at that point in time.
And a couple unique things with respect to school age care too. So because the layoff wouldn't be effective until like June 10th, even with that, the 14-day notice, they still maintain their insurance already for the month of June because they've worked into June. So that premium's already paid. So they're covered for June. Then it's really about July and August, because we're still, and as we were talking to the staff, we're hopeful that we'd be able to recall them for the start of the school year, which is towards the end of August. Kind of the welcome back, bringing them back so that they're ready to care for the kids on that first day of school, before and after care. So we already feel like it's a pretty tight window. And the 60 days would pretty much cover it in terms of that furlough if we want to maintain it. But we're trying to be very open with the employees too, couching it as a layoff, and then what can we do to support you, right? Like, if it is a layoff, this is what we're looking at. But yeah, I mean, certainly this is why we want the two tools, is to have that flexibility to adapt to the changing times. And like that Supreme Court case that just came out was going to be a whole new wrinkle in this whole situation.
Other thoughts, comments? I mean, so just laying out there, you want us to tell you whether to lay off people or to furlough them?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, would you be supportive if we took the approach, let's start with a layoff? And if all of a sudden we get news that there's no way we're going to be able to bring them back, you know, in the next 2 months, are you supportive with us then changing it to a temporary layoff? Because we can do a temporary layoff at any point. Even
So you're saying start with a furlough, Nick, or layoff? I heard you say layoff, but then you
Yeah,
said
you said start with a layoff and then make a temporary layoff.
temporarily start with a furlough.
Okay.
okay.
Because the layoff is the more, you know, final, you know,
I would
answer.
be supportive of that.
I'd be
Starting with
supportive of that.
furlough.
Yes.
Keep our talent.
Okay.
And so you're saying that compared to just laying off everybody now, doing this 60-day furlough just adds $45,000 to
About 30,000.
30,000. Okay.
It just, understand that when we get to the fall, and if we're still not open, people are going to say, well, are you going to furlough me at least for the first 2 months that I would normally be back at work? Because that's what you did with this group of employees.
But I would also say that I think we will be able to, we want to be reflective as we're going forward from the perspective of, as more facts are known, as this develops, hopefully we'll have more knowledge. And if it looks like, yep, we're going back online virtual school in the fall, and it's going to be a more significant period, I think it's okay to treat things differently, as long as, again, we're transparent, we explain the why and why one situation is different from another. I think we're going to have to be flexible and how we're applying these rules in the future. Certainly aware of precedent and aware of how it's been done in the past, but I think some flexibility in every situation. We would never guess we'd be here today looking at the situation. I think we just want to be continuing to be adaptable as we're going forward.
Well, and I haven't gotten through, I was looking, you know, on my phone, was trying to read how the press is interpreting the 132-page, you know, decision and the dissenting opinions, but there's different takes on it. Some say that it's the whole thing is struck down, and others say that something will be able to be put back in place, and it's a lot of lack of clarity about whether Badger bounce back is thrown out with this extension and everything. So with all this uncertainty, I would still leave open the possibility that I mean, we're not committing anything tonight, but you're leaning towards starting with a furlough and then going to layoff. But depending on how things go between now and May 27th, that would be your last day. May 26th would be your last day, right? That you could lay off folks, but you could furlough up until June 2nd, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can lay off. I mean, you could lay off on June 10th. It's just that you're going to pay them for 2 more weeks. I mean, so you can lay off at any point. It's just you're guaranteeing at least 2 more weeks of pay, you know, with the 14 days, and their calendar days, not work days. And, you know, I think what you're probably going to see, I don't know if St. Croix will do it, but they've already, Dane County, Madison-Dane County has already come out and said, as a local public health official, I have the authority to enact basically Executive Order 28 and 31, which is basically the safer at home and Badger bounce back. Therefore, I'm now executing that, and now there's a safer at home order for Dane County, along with tied to a Badger bounce back. So what we could end up seeing is, absolutely, we could see something in St. Croix County and something different in Dunn County and something different in Polk and something different in Pierce. I mean, I think that's probably what this ruling has done. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody can just do what they want. It just means now, instead of it being a statewide thing, each county public health official is now going to be in the hot seat to make this determination. So,
All right. Well, is there anybody else that wants to weigh in on this layoff that and have flexibility to do furlough and then flexibility to do layoff later?
I agree with that.
I'm not hearing anybody that's not. Is there more direction that you need now on anything else related to this, Nick?
no, I think it's also good for you guys to understand how these decisions aren't easy and the information is not clear. And we're trying to do the best we can with the information that we have, but it's there. We do want to value, to Rob's point, we do want to value our employees and their families. And we do think about that at the forefront of what we're doing. And also thinking about, Bruce's point where right now state revenues are projected to be anywhere between $2 and $3 million for the next fiscal year, FY21, or not million, I'm sorry, billion down. And so, we're trying to balance a lot of plates right now. And, and I think Andrea and Tim and Tracy, and as we've gone through this, have all tried to be as upfront with people as they've met with people. I think the last couple of days they've been meeting with people and saying, hey, even though we don't have this in place yet, there's the potential that this is coming. And we want to give you, now 30 days notice, that basically this is coming or potentially be coming. But again, I mean, we could get into phase 1 of the Badger bounce back plan, which would allow us to resume operation. And we're not laying anybody, we're not even furloughing anybody. I mean, because we would kind of continue on through it. But what the things we just don't know is the clarity on some of this stuff and what they're going to allow us to do, what they're not going to allow us to do, and things along those lines. So, but that's all I have. I appreciate it. I think we have direction on where we need to go with things and have a pretty good idea, and we can put some clear language out. We would not be putting this language change out to staff until you guys vote on it.
He wanted a little bit of yesterday.
Oh, it's so hot.
Thank you,
I'll be done in a minute here.
Thank you, Andrea, for the all the deliberation.
Thank you.
All right. So our next meeting is May 26th, and we'll probably decide by that time whether we're doing any retreat at all. But based on the feedback from the last time, it's not sounding like we'll feel like that's needed. But I'm willing to hear feedback from others. It's not on the agenda, so we can't discuss it further. But feel free to send me an email if you are strongly feeling like we need to spend that first Saturday morning in June together. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn this?
So moved.
All right, Rob,
Second.
Second by Bruce. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion is granted and the meeting is adjourned.
Bye, Brady Bunch.